Well, good afternoon, brothers and sisters. Glad to have you back to Tapvideo, Clemson Brown reporting. Got a great guest with us today, Milton Allimadi. You know, we've been doing a series on Africa, the liberation of Africa, the history of Africa. I had a great time because I got a chance to travel through Africa with Milton. We went to Zimbabwe.
Right.
Uh, and then we saw the president at the time, and it was a fact-finding committee that went, in fact, with Charles Barron, Adam Clayton Powell III, myself, Milton, a couple other people that slipped my mind. But Milton, as you know, is a graduate of Columbia, the Graduate School of Columbia University. He created Black Star News, a paper which is still running today. Um, Milton has traveled widely, has achieved a great deal in terms of just laying down a foundation for our people's liberation. Great scholar. Sometimes I think he has one of those photographic memories. I can't see how he remembers all the stuff, but he's right there. And tonight he's going to be discussing Kwame Nkrumah's Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Critical when he wrote it back in 1966. It's critical today in understanding where we are as a people, and it helps liberate us, helps us to understand how we use this particular time to free ourselves with the information that Kwame Nkrumah laid down, 50 years ago. So we're glad to hear from Milton. Milton, one of the things I wish you would kind of give us an insight as to who Kwame Nkrumah was in relationship to Ghana and being the first president of Ghana,
Yes.
and why at that particular time, when his book was published, the American government became so upset. They were giving, I think, Ghana some $26 million or something like that. They withdrew all of the monies and support that they were giving Ghana. Can you give us a little background and why his book was so impactful that America immediately withdrew its contributions to Ghana?
Okay, great. Thank you, as always, for hosting me, Brother Clemson Brown, on your very impactful and important show that all Pan-Africans need to be aware of. It is on this platform that we get to discuss the challenges that our beloved continent, the mother of all humanity and civilization, is facing, and the reasons why the continent faces these challenges. And we get to discuss some of our great African leaders who sacrificed their life in trying to show us the pathway to total liberation of African people everywhere on the continent and on the diaspora. So before I get into the specifics of Kwame Nkrumah's blueprint, I really call it a blueprint because that's what the book is. Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, is not just a critique of the role that capital, Western imperialism, has played in subjugating Africans, but it goes beyond that and it offers the solutions of what must be done. And if a reader wants to be convinced on how powerful this book is, all they need to do is read the introduction. The introduction is less than 10 pages, but it summarizes the entire problem that Africans face. and then it suggests the solution, and then it invites you to read the rest of the book, which I strongly recommend. It is available on Amazon, and believe me, it will be money well spent. Anybody that is not enlightened by this book should come back to me. Come back to me and complain to me. But I am so confident that I recommend this book wholeheartedly. It will not fail to enlighten you, and you will not regret having spent a few dollars to buy this book. If it's the only book you read by Kwame Nkrumah, then let this be the book that you buy. Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Now, let me just spend a few minutes on, as you suggested earlier, who Kwame Nkrumah was, because that explains a lot what the book is all about. Kwame Nkrumah was born in 1909 in what was then the British colony of the Gold Coast in West Africa. He was a bright young student. He got to become a young teacher barely at the age of 20. First of all, in fact, when he was a teenager, 16, he was already a student teacher in one of those colonial high schools in the Gold Coast. And by the time he was 21, he was a teacher and became a young headmaster, in fact, in a secondary school. And obviously, with more education, his eyes are opening, and he starts questioning Ghana's position in the global system, which were dominated, of course, by the European powers, such as Britain, France, and all those other imperialist countries. And then he meets a teacher who had been educated in the US at Columbia. And this teacher starts telling him about Marcus Garvey. So he starts learning about Marcus Garvey's philosophy. The teacher tells him about W.E.B. Du Bois, and he starts reading W.E.B. Du Bois. So, and then eventually at some point he meets Nnamdi Azikiwe, who later on, of course, became one of post-colonial Nigeria's first leaders. And Azikiwe had attended Lincoln University, which of course is an HBCU in the United States. So Azikiwe advised him that if you really want to lift your knowledge of the world, you should go to the United States and attend Lincoln University. So eventually, Nkrumah makes his way to the US in 1935, and he eventually enrolls in Lincoln University. He endures a lot of hardship because he did not come from a wealthy background, so he struggled financially in all the years that he was in the United States. He was able to win some scholarships, which alleviated the tuition payment. And then he did a lot of odd jobs. He was a dishwasher. He was a laborer for a short time. He didn't mind whatever he was doing because he knew the goal was to get education, equip himself to go back and fight for the liberation of Ghana. But Nkrumah's stay in the US made a tremendous impact in his politics because he got to live in Harlem during the summers when he was not in school. He got to see conditions faced by sisters and brothers in this country, our African sisters and brothers in this country, the racism they were enduring, the internal United States colonialism, which was subjecting African sisters and brothers in this country to the same type of exploitation that Africans on the continent were being subjected to. So that gave him a special and unique understanding of imperialism, more so than any of the other African leaders who were also fighting to liberate the continent. By living right here in the United States, it gave Nkrumah a very special outlook that other Africans struggling for liberation of the continent did not have. And also, while here in the United States, he met many leaders. He met CLR James, who ultimately introduced him to George Padmore, the great Trinidadian liberation fighter. George Padmore perhaps had one of the most strong influences on Kwame Nkrumah's life and became a lifelong advisor. Of course, George Padmore died prematurely at a young age. But in 1945, Nkrumah then left the United States in 1942, now armed with degrees from Lincoln University and from the University of Pennsylvania. He got degrees in theology, he got degrees in science education, and he got degrees in philosophy. So then he heads to the United Kingdom. In London, he meets George Padmore and many other Pan-Africans who were living in the United Kingdom. And Nkrumah and George Padmore were the principal organizers of the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in October 1945. And of course, that, I believe, was one of the most impactful of all the Pan-African Congresses that were ever organized. At that Congress, you found future leaders like Jomo Kenyatta, Nnamdi Azikiwe was also there. W.E.B. Du Bois was also there. And that conference really came out with a very powerful statement insisting and demanding on the total independence of African countries from European colonial rule. And then in 1947, Nkrumah then returns to Ghana, and he becomes the Secretary General of one of the earlier parties in Ghana, the Gold Coast Convention Party. But Nkrumah found the party to be a bit too conservative because it was a party of the educated Ghanaian elite, the lawyers, the doctors, the accountants, the early class of African trained professionals. Nkrumah found the party too conservative for his vision. The party, in fact, was not demanding for immediate independence for Ghana. The party was talking for gradual improvement of conditions for Africans in the Gold Coast. So Nkrumah then leaves that party and he creates his own party, the Convention People's Party in Ghana. And that party embraced a grassroots approach and embraced the youth of Ghana and asked for immediate independence, not gradual improvement of conditions for Africans in Ghana. And of course, the British colonial authorities start eyeing him keenly, and eventually they lock him up. They blame him for a protest that had erupted, uprisings, when in fact the protest was the result of Ghanaians being killed by colonial forces when some ex-servicemen who had fought on behalf of empire during World War II went to the colonial governor to demand that the colonial authorities deliver on the promises that had been made to this ex-serviceman, promises that were never kept. And rather than listening to their demands, the police forces and armed forces shot and killed many of these ex-servicemen. And that led to the uprisings. And Nkrumah was targeted and picked out by the British, and he was locked up. But the British at the same time realized that colonialism could no longer endure. Rather than lose everything, the British granted votes for internal self-government. So even though while Nkrumah was still incarcerated, his party actually won and he was elected to the parliament. So the British had no choice but to release Kwame Nkrumah, and he formed the internal self-government. It was not fully independent yet. So they could control all internal affairs. They were not in charge of foreign affairs as well as defense. But a few years later, in 1957, Ghana won its total independence, and Nkrumah became the first prime minister. And I think we discussed in our previous podcast, I should remind listeners, the audience, that Nkrumah invited, in addition to many other guests from the United States, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who was only 27 years old at that time. But Nkrumah could tell that this was a future leader in the United States and invited him to attend that celebration of Ghana's independence. Nkrumah was, of course, and we now remember him as one of the most effective advocates for African unity. Nkrumah said that, and this is what he really wrote and focused on in the book as well, that the Western countries, the imperial countries, wanted our resources and wanted the cheap labor before independence. What makes you think they will not want it after formal independence? They will still want it. So the only way we can protect our sovereignty and our resources is by uniting and forming a United States of Africa. He made that argument very passionately when the Organization of African Unity was formed in 1963 in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. But Nkrumah was not only working on trying to convince fellow African leaders on the need for immediate independence. Nkrumah was also dealing with the imperial powers who were also working overtime to convince the other African leaders not to pursue Nkrumah's approach to immediate independence and unity and a United States of Africa. Eventually, the African countries were divided into two groups. The Casablanca group, which included, of course, Ghana and Morocco and countries like Egypt, which under Gamal Abdel Nasser was actually very socialist and very Africa-oriented in its outlook. It saw itself fully as a part of the African continent and not as a part of the Middle East, as contemporary Egypt most of the time now sees itself. And then the other party was the Monrovia group. That included, of course, Liberia, included major countries as well, like Nigeria. And these were the countries that were advocating for a more gradual approach toward unity. But Nkrumah said, he gave this warning. He said, listen, as the years go by, we will become accustomed to being called presidents or prime ministers. It will be much more difficult to unite in the future. And that is why it's critical to do it now, immediately, when we are not yet set and used to being called presidents all over the African continent. Unfortunately, Nkrumah did not succeed, and Africa has suffered the consequences of the failure to form a United States of Africa. We've suffered the consequences since the OAU was formed in 1963. As the audience must know, the OAU has now been replaced by the African Union, which was formed in 2002. And yet, if you see how the African Union is now conducting itself, you must admit that the dream and the vision that Kwame Nkrumah had for United States of Africa is still far into the future. So this is Kwame Nkrumah, and I think this gives a better understanding of this book and why he wrote this book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. So in the book, Nkrumah has many good points. So let me just focus on a few, and you'll see how prescient he really was. You can almost see that he was a visionary, because a lot of the things he wrote about has now come to bear, sadly and tragically, in most African countries. Number one, Nkrumah said, these countries may look like they're independent countries, but in reality, the people that really push the levers of power are going to be the former colonial powers. And how will they do it? They would do it by finance. And as we now know, that's what they've been doing for decades now, using the IMF and the World Bank to control African countries. They give them these loans, and these loans come with conditions. And some of the conditions are very damaging, conditions which would not be acceptable even here in the United States. So, for example, they remove subsidies from food. They remove subsidies from education. They remove subsidies from health care. How are people supposed to survive? Those are the conditions for these loans. And then another very damaging condition is that you should not focus on industries. So in other words, they force African countries to continue selling their raw materials to the industrialized countries and then buying manufactured products at a very high price, rather than using those raw materials to industrialize, to produce manufacturers, and to export the manufacturers and earn higher revenue for these African countries. And Nkrumah predicted that is going to be the system that they'll maintain, and that's in this book. He made many other predictions. He said they will use other African countries to undermine other African countries and to keep them fighting. And sure enough, we have many examples from Africa. We've seen how Uganda and Rwanda have been used to invade a sister African country, Democratic Republic of the Congo, multiple times, leading to the deaths of millions of Africans in the Congo. Yet, even while people are dying in the millions in the Congo, in Eastern Congo, all these Western mining companies are extracting billions of dollars worth of resources. So these wars of genocide are profitable genocide for Western corporations. And sadly, they're using African misrulers as the face of these invasions. And then they portray it as, oh, this is another one of those African problems that happen all the time. Nkrumah discussed how that would happen in his book, unless we form a United States of Africa. Nkrumah also said they will keep African countries always divided because they know that by forming a United States of Africa, they will be able to create huge markets. If you create huge markets for your products, you don't need to be exporting to the former colonial powers anymore, because now suddenly you have a huge market in Africa itself. And by having a huge market, that also provides more impetus to industrialize. Because if you manufacture products, it's very costly. So it's good to have a huge market for your manufacturers. And that lowers the cost and it makes it affordable. And that's how you can industrialize. And Nkrumah was also very forward-looking. He said we should not compete amongst ourselves as African countries in terms of industrialization. So, for example, if Ghana is going to be producing certain manufactured products, Nigeria should produce different types of products. The countries in East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, they should produce different types of manufactured products so that we're not competing with each other, but we are finding markets for all of us and then to the rest of the world as well. And then at the end of it, he says, all of this can only be achieved in one way, by a United States of Africa. And in fact, let me read that section from the introduction very briefly before I come back to you, Conrad, for your questions.
Okay.
Okay, so let me read this part quickly and then I'm done. He says, the less developed world will not become developed through the goodwill or generosity of the developed powers. It can only become developed through a struggle against the external forces which have a vested interest in keeping it undeveloped. Of these forces, neocolonialism is, at this stage of history, the principal. I propose to analyze neocolonialism, first by examining the state of the African continent and showing how neocolonialism at the moment keeps it artificially poor. Next, I propose to show how, in practice, African unity, which in itself can only be established by the defeat of neocolonialism, could immensely raise African living standards. From this beginning, I propose to examine neocolonialism generally, first historically, and then by consideration of the great international monopolies whose continued stranglehold on the neocolonial sectors of the world ensures the continuation of the system. This is how Nkrumah concludes the introduction to this great book, which I highly recommend to everybody who's listening to us now. Thank you, brother.
Just in terms of a comment, having been to Ghana and having had the opportunity to meet a lot of the African Americans that Kwame Nkrumah actually invited to Ghana to help be a part of the revolution, not the revolution at that time because Ghana had its independence, but the government of Ghana. I remember, Dr. One of the doctors there, by the way, Professor Leonard Jeffries carried us to Ghana as a pilgrimage after a year of each week we had a different book to read. And then after a year, we did the pilgrimage to Ghana. And Dr. Clark,
John Henry Clark, yes.
John Henry Clark, he had went to Ghana during the time of Kwame Nkrumah's leadership.
Yes.
And Kwame
wrote about it.
Yeah, Kwame reached out and saw him in the audience and actually drafted him to be a part of the government in
right.
which
Give him a job as an editor, right?
Yeah, he served for a while with Kwame Nkrumah, and there was a great love affair that was going on between African Americans
absolutely.
and Ghanaian people, and it's still unto this day.
Absolutely.
I spent a lot of time. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Ghana, and it's unlike any other place. Right. And most African Americans who go to Ghana fall in love with it, even to this day.
Yes.
Many of the slave dungeons of Africa are actually in Ghana. I think some 42. And so,
let's not forget W.B. Du Bois. He's actually buried in Ghana.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and they have like a museum, a Kwame Nkrumah museum there, where his tomb is enshrined.
Yes.
And everybody goes there actually.
Malcolm X went. Malcolm met Nkrumah in this presidential office in Ghana.
Yeah. So I mean, the relationship is so close, and African Americans have played such a pivotal role, really, in the liberation of Africa, as we
absolutely, without a doubt,
all the time. Things have changed now because we don't. Our history has not been taught, and so we don't really know who we are. But up until recently, we knew we were Africans. We claimed our Africanness, and we worked along with many of the African leaders. Here we did demonstrations. we did everything, not just demonstrations, but even in Dr. Clark's um, in the movie that was done about Dr. Clark, that was done by what's the brother's actor? He pointed out how African Americans actually signed up to go to Ethiopia
Right.
with Haile
When Ethiopia
Selassie.
was invaded by Mussolini, correct?
Yeah, to actually fight on the side. I mean, so
But
many
they
of
were
them that were
denied. They
getting
were
out.
denied passports. Remember, they were denied travel documents, even
Yeah,
though
that is true.
Europeans, Italian Americans were allowed to travel to go fight on behalf of the fascists. But African Americans, Caribbean Africans who wanted to go fight on behalf of Ethiopia, they were denied travel documents. So I'm glad you brought that aspect of the history up.
Yeah, it's so important because Dr. Clark talks about after World War II, uh, uh, many African Americans wanted to go back, and he talks about the Air Force that Ghana could have achieved from blacks who were in the
That's
Air
right.
Force here. They
Right.
wanted to go and help form the Air Force of Ghana. I mean, we need to know that was a great movement on behalf of African Americans to
We need to know that that is a movement that needs to be revived because that is the solution to total African liberation and to Africa enjoying its vast, rich mineral resources to enrich Africans on the continent and Africans in diaspora as well. So we need to revive that relationship fully as it was beginning to be formed in the 1960s. I agree with you totally.
yeah. So that my trips to Ghana and the experience that I had in Ghana, it's just tremendous. I mean, I've been to the slave dungeons when African Americans show up there and seeing the spirit of our ancestors actually invade the bodies, the physical bodies of African Americans who I remember one sister who just she couldn't the spirit just got into her, knocked her down, and she spoke another language. She could not get back to herself and everything, and they had to bring the native priestess and everything to treat her, and it took hours
Right,
to get the ancestor spirits to let her be.
right,
But she was speaking in all kinds of African languages and so
right.
forth. So there's a spiritual component that's going on that I don't find it as prevalent among our people as I did back then. There was just such an openness
Right,
and willingness. There was a great love affair
right,
that went on with this generation, my generation,
right,
people like James Smalls and uh, Professor Jeffries and all
right,
of those, even the great psychiatrist who was with us on one of those visits with us, who could explain what was going on with the spirits that were entering our people. And he was talking about that those spirits had never left us, and they recognized us, and we can return to this oneness with our people if we would teach it, if we would practice it, and that liberation would free both African Americans and Africans on the continent. But it is in our history that we
Was that
become
was that Dr. Poussin? Was
No,
it
it was the brother in
not
California.
Alvin Poussin? Okay.
Oh no, it wasn't him.
Okay,
The
now
brother,
we should also mention Randall Robinson and TransAfrica
yes,
and the big
yes, yes,
role that they played
absolutely.
in
Yeah,
the liberation
absolutely.
of South Africa.
It, in fact, you were talking about the OAU, but they have sent representatives here uh, to retrieve our people and let them know that they must return home. And Africa is being built, and this is what the representative of the OAU was saying. Africa is moving forward into the future. Somebody has to build bridges, somebody has to build tunnels, and there's over 100 cities that are on the planning board for Africa, major cities, all of them with over 1 million people. They have to be built. And, you know, we don't have jobs and all of that here, but the opportunities that await for us on the continent, if we would get involved in building Africa so that that too becomes our home and our future. So I would like for you to speak on that in terms of what awaits us when we go home, if we join in building it. Other than that, we're just going to evaporate here in America.
Right, evaporate here and evaporate in Africa as well, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I don't think there should be, African people should not be living in impoverishment on the continent and in diaspora. Because a productive Africa would be able to also make sure that Africans in diaspora are also being productive. So, for example, sisters and brothers in diaspora, in a capitalist economy, you cannot function without access to finance. So if you are discriminated against in terms of access to finance, to build your enterprise, to sustain yourself, to send your children to good schools, and to consume healthy foods and live a healthy lifestyle, that is a death sentence. And it's a death sentence because the universe is limited. Your only potential access to finance are from these banks here that discriminate against you. Now, if African countries were functioning normally and really benefiting from the tremendous wealth that is currently being used to build wealth in the industrialized countries rather than in Africa, then Africans on the continent would not be impoverished, and African in diaspora would not be impoverished either. Because just like you find European banks here in the United States, you would find African banks here in the United States, so that sisters and brothers could have access to financing from these African banks. You see? So by making Africa really succeed, we are uplifting Africans all over the world. What are the types of resources that are available on the continent? Let's just look at one country, for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A recent World Bank estimate from a couple of years ago estimated the natural resource and mineral resource wealth at $30 trillion with a T. That was maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. And since that report, more finds of resources have been made in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is just one example, one country. You can duplicate this by dozens of other African countries. So Congo, for example, has about 70% of the world's cobalt. And cobalt is very critical in the production of the batteries for electric cars. So there should be no excuse for the Congo not to really uplift the standard of living of every Congolese and for other Africans on the continent and in diaspora. Because electric cars are the cars of the present and the future. You just heard yesterday or the day before when President Biden announced that by 2050, and that's not a long time from now, 50% of cars, in fact, my mistake, I believe he said 2020, which is very soon, 50% of automobiles would have to be electric cars.
It was 2030.
2030. Very good. Thank you for the correction. It's still very soon, just down the line.
Yeah.
Imagine. But Congo will not benefit if Congo does not get a fair price for
its cobalt.
So this is where we really see the need for African unity, because Congo alone will not be able to defend that cobalt. If the leader of the Congo says, this is what I'm demanding for the cobalt, he has to watch his back, as you know. And that is the challenge. So one of the things we need to do is also to push African leaders toward unity. We have to get them out of that mindset that Nkrumah pointed out in 1963, that we can't just celebrate everybody wanting to be a president and holding back the potential of the continent because you want to have 54 or 55 presidents and prime ministers in Africa. We shouldn't allow that. That needs to be one of our missions. We, and when I say we, I'm talking about Africans on the continent and in diaspora, fought very hard to liberate the continent from European colonial rule. We fought very hard to liberate the continent from white apartheid in South Africa, in what was then Rhodesia, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Guinea-Bissau. So now I am saying we need to focus in a similar way, with similar passion, to push for African unity, a United States of Africa. Let me leave you with this one vision to contemplate. And we don't talk about this much because it's quite shameful, actually. And that's, I imagine, why we don't often talk about this. You see African youth, the cream of the continent, our young people, drowning while trying to navigate across the Mediterranean on these rickety outfits, wanting to go there and to work, washing dishes, cleaning toilets, working as almost enslaved laborers on those farms in southern Italy, in order to be able to send some money back to their parents and their relatives back home in Africa. That is unconscionable. How is that even acceptable? While at the same time, Western corporations in cahoots with these African misrulers are mining resources worth billions of dollars and enriching their corporations and their shareholders, while our young people have to drown crossing the Atlantic. Think about that. I think that, to me, at least personally, is what really motivates me on a daily basis to denounce misrulers in Africa, to push for African unity, to promote any leader I see in Africa who bears a resemblance to Kwame Nkrumah or bears a resemblance to Thomas Sankara.
Sister Moshe, are you with us? Yes, Sister Moshe. Yeah, Ngumbi. Sister Moshe. Okay, she wanted to join us, so I see her, but I can't hear her. All right.
Maybe she's on mute. Sometimes people are on mute, so maybe she's talking and you can't hear her because she's on mute. I don't know if that's the case.
Oops, my bad. Thank you. I was on mute.
Could you hear what we were discussing?
Yes, I'm sitting here. I'm trying to turn on the camera. I was having issues with my computer. But yes, I have quite a few questions. I don't know how much time we have left, but
No,
I'm
go ahead.
okay. Greetings, Professor Milton Allimadi.
Greetings, sister.
Okay, so my first question, based on what I hear, well, basically, what is the actual role? No, I should have wrote this down. Okay, so when we were speaking about the AU and
Right.
they have, yeah. So was it last month? I believe it was last month that the African Union actually allowed Israel to be.
Yes.
So I need for you to speak on that because I got some serious issues with that, and I want to hear your viewpoint.
Well, that was actually what I was hinting at when I said the African Union is right now under the control of neo-colonialism. Really, it's that's literally an abandonment of the position that African countries had maintained for a long time, supporting the liberation of Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle, and a total rejection of the recent bombing campaign against the Palestinians, when more than 200 people were killed. And on the other side, 12 people died in Israel. This disproportionate, indiscriminate attack. And so now, what do you have the African Union do? Allows Israel to become an observer member on July the 22nd, when, in fact, a few years ago, Haiti, which is an African country in the Western Hemisphere, was denied membership. So, of course, it's completely outrageous, but it speaks to how far the AU has slid in the wrong direction. And people like Nkrumah, of course, would be rolling in their graves were they to be informed of this development. But I'm happy to say it has met very vigorous resistance by African leaders. I have a lot of issues and complaints against many African leaders, but on this occasion, some of them have stepped forward and have rejected this move. Nigeria, South Africa. South Africa said a decision of this magnitude should be voted on by the leaders of every African country. But this decision was made by the chairperson of the African Union Commission, who would be the equivalent of a Secretary General of the United Nations, for example. So he plays that role for the African Union. And why would he make this decision? Because this is his name is Mahamat Musa Faki. He is from Chad, and Chad is one of the most neo-colonial of all the countries in Africa, a former French colony. Recently, for example, when the general who ran that country, Idris Deby, when he was killed, the president of France rushed to Chad and to ensure that Deby's son, who himself is a general, would be installed as a leader, even though the people of Chad want to determine their own destiny. So this is just a manifestation of how much under the control of outsiders the African Union really is, and it should not be surprising. So, for example, in 2016, I was looking for much more recent data, but I was not able to come up with recent data. But in 2016, 60% of the budget of the African Union came from outside Africa. It came from the European Union. It came from Britain, from the United States, from Canada, from China, and from a few of the European Nordic countries. So this just shows you that the African Union is not really under the full control of Africans, and that is the sad aspect. And that explains why that decision which you just asked about was made.
Yeah, so this is the issue. Is like when we look at the establishments that are already in place to be part of the equation for our solutions, we definitely must recognize that we can't look to any establishment that the oppressor has established among our people, because it's basically their politics is nothing but about greed and arrogance and falsehood and hero worship and injustice. And they basically take it to the extremes and are organized into teams, which are the nations and the parties and the interest groups that they have established to be the voice for the people, but not necessarily be about people. So our people cannot acknowledge information as power unless the information itself is become an application. So there has to be a format. There has to be a people that are coming together that is able to write a manifesto that would actually not even allow one person to make a decision, because you best believe that Israel implementation is going to stay, because it's still all about getting these these falsified leaders to be in compliance with their new world order. Absolutely. And why our people continue to struggle for freedom, it would never be so as long as we're looking to the leadership that is established by our oppressor. We have more, our people are born leaders. Yes. Our people are born a power that is a very great threat to our oppressors. Now, they are so fearful they can't take us one-on-one in a philosophical or spiritual perspective. So they have to take one of our own kind. And that brainwashing that me and Daddy Brown was speaking of earlier today, this is one of those strategies that they use of distraction. And the primary element is basically a social control in the strategies of distraction to allow our people to be distracted while they're pulling the strings of their puppets in order to be implemented and infiltrate a position that once they get in, they're like a cancer. And the only way to get rid of it is through a divine union of a spirituality that would always be present. But, the spirit of truth, is going to make changes simply because falsehood cannot remain. But it definitely going to have to take people with a mind of strategic planning and know not to do it publicly in order to make things happen. But that's very appalling. And I'm grateful that it happened to show no matter where we look for our freedom and liberty and our sovereignty to return, as long as we continue to look through the flesh and blood of a system that was established to oppress our people and not lift our people, we're going to fail every time. And so we have to look within the wisdom of our village, look within the wisdom within ourselves to come up with a solution that is going to be beneficial for ourselves and not that of our oppressor. And with that, I'm complete.
No, I agree totally. Hopefully, there's a strong resistance. I would not be shocked if at some stage this decision is actually reversed. Botswana has put out a statement dissociating itself with this decision, says Botswana has nothing to do with it and does not want to be associated with it. And South Africa has called for a meeting so that this chairperson of the commission can explain what happened to all the African leaders. Then, of course, the enemies of Africa are trying to divide the continent. So you're going to have people that are going to be given a lot of money to support this decision, and the ones that oppose it will not have access to funding. And that will have some impact as well. So we have to wait and see how this evolves. But I'm encouraged at least by the strong statement by South Africa, which is, of course, a major country. Also, for listeners, I want to also point out one other thing. Please go to this website, www.history.state.gov. This website has all the correspondences, or at least most of the correspondences, between U.S. government and the State Department and U.S. diplomats that were sent around the world. And it goes back historically, I think, well over 100 years. But if you're interested in the period dealing with Africa, then you should focus on around after World War II, up to date. And on that website, one of the searches you should put U.S. or put CIA and Ghana coup, or put U.S. and Kwame Nkrumah and coup. Put any combination of searches, and you'll find some very interesting documents. You'll find memos of U.S. officials celebrating the coup d'etat in Ghana. You'll find memos giving instructions that the World Bank and the IMF, the World Bank principally, which was funding that major project, the Volta project, the dam, to build all that energy for Ghana, was instructed to delay the disbursement of the funds so that Nkrumah's government would be weakened and the economic condition would worsen and he would become unpopular so that the armed forces could overthrow him. So the U.S. role in overthrowing Nkrumah is not a matter of speculation. In their own writing, you can find it on that website. So it's www.history.state.gov, G-O-V.
Milton, can you spend just a couple more minutes with us?
Yes, of course, brother.
Okay, Sister Moshe, do you have any other questions for Milton?
Yes. Okay, so this is also in reference to the unit UN. I also noticed that there's 55, I think it's still 55 states that is up under that umbrella. Correct. And one of them happens to be Ghana. So what is Ghana saying in reference to this infiltration? In reference to this infiltration, and why cannot Ghana establish a platform that does not have to depend or have to have their voice on a seat, but be the seat of liberty and freedom of our people?
All right. Now, in the case of Ghana, I've not seen a recent statement, but what I do recall was then when the president of Ghana visited Israel, I believe it was about maybe 3-4 years ago. The coverage was very, the tone of the coverage was that this was going to build greater relation between Ghana and Israel and other African countries as well. This is like opening the door to other African countries. So I would not be surprised if Ghana does not put out a statement objecting to this, to Israel's membership as observer in the AU. But as I said, I've not seen a statement. The only statements that I've seen, to be honest with you, the strong ones, are the one from South Africa and the one from Botswana.
Milton, just two questions from me finally. Nigeria, because Africa, the continent of Africa, the strongest state for African people in Africa is Nigeria. So I'd like to know what Nigeria's position on Israel's membership as well. And my final question to you is the role that Gaddafi, how he saw Africa's liberation and the plan of it in terms of Africa's own banking system, its currency, gold has been the primary trading instrument for African countries. And but can you talk a little bit about that? And we'll set up for our next interview with you.
Very good. I believe Nigeria actually did also oppose this admission of Israel, and I should also mention actually Algeria also did the same. So yes, you're right. These are major economies, beginning with South Africa and Nigeria, and now Algeria as well, have actually opposed this admission of Israel. And I imagine there's a lot of conversations going on right now amongst African countries to try to get more of them to put out official statements. And I can assure you that at the same time this is going on, there's a lot of arm twisting by the United States as well to get African countries to support this. And why do I say this? Because the U.S. Secretary of State, Blinken, put out a tweet supporting the decision by the chairperson of the African Union Commission to admit Israel as an observer. So the same struggle that Nkrumah faced in the 1960s is ongoing, where you have Nkrumah at that time trying to get Africans to do one thing, which was to unite immediately, while in the background you have the United States and other powers working vigorously to divide African countries from taking that position. So I would, without a doubt, something like that is going on right now in the background. I imagine France, United States, and Britain are all trying to keep Africans divided on that position. In terms of what you said about Gaddafi, that, of course, is the reason why Gaddafi was killed. If you recall, when some documents were made available, I think it was via WikiLeaks, and the documents included a correspondence from one of Hillary Clinton's advisors. She was the Secretary of State at the time when Gaddafi was killed. And that advisor of Clinton, I believe it was Sidney Blumenthal, sent her some correspondence saying that the French had objected to the role that Gaddafi was playing in trying to create a common African currency, which would be backed by Libyan gold, and that he had made billions of dollars worth of Libyan gold available to back this new currency. And of course, if this currency had been created, it would immediately have impacted France's economy, because the French control much of West Africa by controlling their currency. which is called the CFA franc, which is tied to the French franc. But by creating an independent African currency, that would have caused that system to collapse, with beneficial impact for African countries, but negative impact for France. So that was essentially the main reason why France, at that time, I believe the president was Sarkozy, made sure that not only was Gaddafi overthrown, but that he was killed as well. And as you know, Sarkozy was more recently convicted of corruption because he'd apparently taken money from Gaddafi's family to help finance his presidential campaign in France. And that definitely was another reason why he wanted to make sure he silenced Gaddafi so that he would never talk about that money that had been given to Sarkozy. But ultimately, I mean, Africans know what needs to be done. We started off the conversation by reminding people of this book. And I would like to remind people about this book again by Kwame Nkrumah, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. It's a book that is easy to read. It is very well written. And it will really enlighten you a lot about and give you a better understanding of the current challenges that Africa faces. But at the same time, it also offers solutions. I like books that critique the problem, but also offer solution. And this book is certainly one of them. So I strongly suggest people go to Amazon and order this book. You will not regret ordering this book.
I got to ask you another question in closing. Now, this is it. I ain't going to ask them.
Yes, sir.
But recently, they found a mountain of gold in the Congo. There have been many YouTube pictures of the village just digging up the dirt and the gold, taking it back to their homes, washing it, and they had bags of gold nuggets and gold dust. And Israel was one of the countries that said that the Congo owed them billions of dollars. And so everybody's moving in to claim the gold. What have you heard about it? Is that true? This mountain, a mounting of gold, just to give you an idea of how rich Africa is and how the Creator at this time is bringing, is showing us the wealth that we have, etc. But your comment, and we're going to look forward to next week.
Well, this particular story, actually, you have to confess, I'm not familiar with it. But as I said earlier, Congo is blessed with tremendous mineral wealth and resources. In fact, gold is going to pale in comparison to cobalt. Because there are billions of automobiles in the world, billions of cars in the world. You're going to have a piece of the Congo in each and every one of those cars. So in fact, the cobalt is going to be the new gold for the Congo. Everybody drives around the world, and we are switching to electric soon. And without Congo, we can't have those cars. So just imagine. We need to just find a way to protect the progressive. First of all, we need to get the right type of leaders in all these countries, and then we have to make sure that we protect them. Malcolm used to come out and protest in support of African leaders who are doing the right thing by their people. We need to restore that kind of activity on a regular basis.
Milton, I want to thank you. It's a blessing, actually, to hear you every week. I wait to hear you.
Thank you, comrade. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for hosting me, and thanks for the sister to joining us today as well.
Yes, okay. It was my pleasure, and I am aware of that Congo mountain of gold due to the fact that I brought it to Daddy Brown attention. And but the amazing thing is, from a spiritual as well as a physical perspective, the divine spirit shows us that we are wealthy.
Yes.
At the same time, the spirit also shows that our blessing and our ability to soar is not going to be rooted in material substance. Because as soon as they found it, they came in.
Yes.
Now, this mountain of gold wasn't located in a mine. This was in an African village where the people have full control over what it is that they found. But they actually came in and took the gold and shut down the mountain where people of their status, well, according to them, would not be able to rise up. So we still have to look at when they have an agenda that's all the way in 2063 in order for us to so-called quote unquote to become free. And one of the solutions is not to be on the calendar of the Greco-Roman and the oppressors and the foreigners that come in with their own culture and how things are supposed to be, because whatever's good for the goose is supposed to be good for the gander. However they treat us when it comes to businesses, we must be able to produce the same contract and they get treated the same way. But we also have to recognize that it goes deeper. We're a spiritual people, and our ability to be able to establish our reparations and restoration and redemption is not going to come through the same system that exploits, demise, mistreat, and do all type of evil to us because of their principalities and powers and their spiritual wickedness and their rulers of darkness and their workers of iniquity, agents in church and state and in any institution that is influential to our people. So that information is very key to show us we have the wealth, but the wealth is not going to free us. We have to return and be rooted into the spirituality that governs and that we are the stewardship over it, and everything else is already here, for our advancement. But we have to utilize this first eye of a mind of being able to strategically come to a table of strategic planning and not invite the same people who does not have our best interests at hand. And with that, I'm complete.
And with that, Milton, we want to thank you. But
Ray.
before we go, there's
Yes,
one
sir.
person that I really want to thank, and that's Darrell Good. Darrell is in the background, but Darrell sets all this up. I mean, without him, we crash. So he's the pilot. Darrell, thank you, man. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Darrell.
I look forward to the next meeting. Peace and
blessings.
Right. Have a good week.
All right, you too.
Thank you so much.